Some animals are not born broken. They are born carrying a truth the world is too blind to see. The wind moved low across the Texas plains that night, dragging dust along the fences like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. And beneath the dim glow of a single barn light, a group of men stood in silence around something small and trembling in the dirt. The millionaire's voice cut through the stillness, calm and distant, as if he were discussing a faulty machine rather than a living thing. And with a brief motion of his hand, he made a decision that no one dared question. Not here, not on this land where everything had a price and anything without value was quietly erased. The newborn foal lay on its side, its thin legs folded awkwardly beneath it, its coat still damp and clinging to its fragile frame, and its eyes, pale and unfocused, never quite settling on anything at all, not the men, not the barn, not the world it had just entered, as though sight had never been part of its design. Someone shifted uneasily, boots grinding against gravel, but no one spoke, because they all understood what was expected, what always happened when something didn't meet the standard. Except one man lingered at the edge of the circle, his hat pulled low, his hands still, his breath slow and measured like he was trying not to disturb something sacred. And his name was Ethan Cole, a ranch hand most people barely noticed, a man who had learned long ago that silence was safer than standing out. He had seen animals come and go, had watched strong ones praised and weak ones forgotten. But there was something about the way this foal breathed, shallow but stubborn, something in the way its ears twitched toward the faintest sound, as if it were listening to a world beyond what eyes could see, that held him there longer than he intended. The millionaire turned away, already finished with the moment, already thinking about the next profitable thing, and the others followed, their footsteps fading into the hum of generators and distant cattle, leaving behind only the quiet and the fragile rhythm of the foal's breathing. Ethan did not move right away, not even when the last truck door slammed shut in the distance, because something in his chest had tightened in a way he couldn't ignore, a memory perhaps, or a question he had buried too deep to name. He stepped closer, slow and careful, the way you approach something that might break under the weight of a single wrong move. And as he knelt beside the small body, the foal stirred, not in fear, not in panic, but with a strange, searching motion, its head lifting slightly, turning not toward his face but toward the sound of his breath. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering in the air before finally lowering, brushing gently against the animal's neck, and the warmth he felt there, faint but steady, made something shift inside him. The foal did not pull away, did not resist, instead it leaned, just barely, into his touch, as if recognizing something it had never seen. The wind carried a distant clang of metal from somewhere beyond the pasture, and the foal's ears flicked sharply toward it, its body tensing for a brief second before settling again. And Ethan frowned, glancing toward the dark horizon, then back at the fragile creature beside him. "You're still listening," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than to the animal, because it didn't make sense, not the way this one responded, not the way it seemed to follow sounds with a precision that felt almost intentional. The barn light flickered once, casting long shadows across the dirt, and in that brief moment, Ethan made a choice he knew would cost him, though he couldn't yet say how. He reached for the worn blanket draped over the fence, wrapped it carefully around the foal's trembling body, and lifted it into his arms, surprised by how light it was, like holding something unfinished, something the world had given up on too soon. As he turned toward the far end of the ranch, away from the main house, away from the rules that had just been spoken without words, the foal shifted again, its head tilting toward the open land ahead, toward something unseen. And for the first time that night, Ethan felt a quiet, unshakable thought settle in his mind, one that didn't belong to logic or experience, but to something deeper, older, something that sounded almost like a promise. Maybe this one wasn't meant to be left behind. The small barn at the far edge of the property had not been used in years. Its wood faded to a pale gray, and its roofline dipping slightly, as if it had grown tired of holding itself up against the endless Texas wind. And yet it was the only place Ethan could think of where no one would come looking before morning. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, the hinges groaning low and slow, then stepped inside where the air smelled of dry hay, old iron, and dust that had not been disturbed in a long time. And for a moment he just stood there listening, not to the silence, but to the rhythm in his arms, that faint, stubborn breathing that had not given up despite everything that had already been decided for it. He set the foal down gently onto a bed of loose straw, adjusting the worn blanket so it covered most of its small frame, then knelt beside it, watching closely as its sides rose and fell in uneven intervals, each breath a quiet effort that seemed to echo in the hollow space of the barn. Outside, the wind brushed against the walls in long, steady strokes, and somewhere in the distance a loose piece of metal tapped faintly against a fence post, a hollow, repeating sound that carried through the night like a signal, and the foal reacted instantly, its ears lifting, its head turning toward the sound with a precision that made Ethan pause. It did not hesitate, did not search aimlessly. It simply aligned itself with that direction, as if it knew exactly where the sound lived, and even after the tapping stopped, the foal remained still, facing the same way, listening to something that lingered beyond what human ears could follow. Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his weight on his heels, his eyes narrowing as he studied the animal more carefully now, not with pity, but with curiosity that edged into something deeper, something he had not felt in a long time. "You cannot see a thing, can you?" he said quietly, his voice barely louder than the wind outside. And yet the foal shifted again at the sound, its head tilting just enough to face him, not exactly, but close enough to make it clear that it knew he was there. He reached out once more, letting his hand rest lightly against its neck, and the warmth he felt there seemed steadier now, less fragile than before, as if being brought into this quiet place had given it something it had not had out in the open, something like a chance. Time passed without him noticing, measured only by the slow change in the air as the night deepened and the temperature dropped a few degrees. And Ethan found himself moving without thinking, gathering old sacks to block the cracks in the walls, dragging a rusted water bucket closer even though he knew the foal would not drink yet, doing small things that did not fix anything but somehow felt necessary. At one point he stepped outside to the well, pulling up a small amount of water that smelled faintly of earth and iron, and when he returned, the barn felt different, not louder, not brighter, but occupied in a way it had not been before. The foal was standing now, unsteady, its legs trembling as it adjusted to the unfamiliar weight of its own body. And for a brief second Ethan held his breath, expecting it to fall, but it did not. It simply steadied itself, its head lifting again toward that same unseen point beyond the walls, as if something out there was calling it in a language it understood without needing sight. Ethan set the bucket down slowly, his gaze following the direction the foal faced. But there was nothing there, only darkness stretching across the pasture, broken by distant fences and the faint outline of hills under a sky that offered no answers. He stepped closer, instinctively reaching out in case the animal faltered, but before he could touch it, the foal took a single step forward, careful, deliberate, its hooves finding the ground as if guided by something beneath the surface rather than above it. Ethan stopped where he was, watching, not interfering, because something in the moment told him this was not fear, not confusion, but intention, quiet and undeniable. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a deeper metallic echo from farther out across the land, and the foal responded immediately, its body aligning with that distant sound once more, and, for the first time since he had lifted it from the dirt, Ethan felt a flicker of something that did not belong to reason, a realization that settled slowly but firmly into place. Whatever had been left behind out there in the dark, whatever had made this small, blind creature listen so closely to the world, had not finished speaking yet. The night stretched longer than Ethan expected, the kind of slow, heavy darkness that settles deep into the land and makes every sound feel sharper, more deliberate. And inside the old barn he found himself sitting against the rough wooden wall, hat lowered over his eyes, not sleeping, just listening the way the foal listened, as if the silence itself might speak if given enough time. The small creature had not laid back down. Instead it remained standing near the open side of the stall, its thin legs trembling less now, its body adjusting in quiet increments to the weight it carried, and every few minutes its head would tilt, ears lifting towards something beyond the barn, something that came and went with the wind, but never fully disappeared. Ethan noticed a pattern forming, not one he could explain easily, but one that repeated with enough consistency to settle into his thoughts. The distant metallic echo would rise from the far end of the property, faint and irregular, and each time it did, the foal responded before the sound fully reached him, as if it were hearing it sooner, or perhaps sensing it in a way that did not rely on ears alone. He stood slowly, careful not to startle the animal, and stepped closer, his boots pressing softly into the straw. "What is it you keep finding out there?" he asked under his breath, though he knew no answer would come in words. And yet the foal shifted again at the sound of his voice, turning its head slightly toward him before, returning its focus outward, steady, unwavering, as though whatever it was following mattered more than anything inside these walls. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it a colder edge, and the sky above the plains began to lighten just enough to hint at the coming dawn, that faint gray line along the horizon that separates night from day without fully belonging to either. Ethan stepped out of the barn for a moment, pulling his jacket tighter against the chill, and looked across the land that stretched wide and empty before him, fences running in long straight lines, a rusted windmill turning slow and uneven in the distance, and beyond that, a section of ground that had not been used in years, land the ranch owner had long ago decided held no value. He had passed that area countless times without a second thought, just another forgotten piece of property. But now, standing there in the early quiet, he realized something he had not considered before. The faint metallic sound, the one the foal kept responding to, it always came from that direction. He turned back toward the barn, his gaze settling on the small figure inside, still facing the same unseen point, still listening with a focus that felt almost deliberate. And for the first time a thought formed clearly enough to stay, not a guess, not a passing idea, but something firmer, something that asked to be followed. When he stepped back inside, the foal reacted instantly, its ears lifting at the sound of his boots, its body shifting slightly toward him, and for a brief moment it moved as if to approach, but then it stopped, turning again toward the open side of the barn, as if reminding him where its attention truly lay. Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing once more toward the dark stretch of land beyond the fences, then back at the foal, and there was a quiet understanding in that moment, something unspoken but undeniable, that whatever had drawn this animal's focus through the night had not been random, had not been confusion, it had been direction. He reached down and adjusted the blanket around its shoulders, his hand lingering there for a second longer than necessary, then straightened, his decision settling into place without the need for further thought. "All right," he murmured, voice low and steady. "When the sun comes up, we see what you have been hearing." And as if it understood more than it should, the foal relaxed slightly under his touch, its breathing evening out, its head lowering just a fraction, not in weakness, but in a quiet acceptance, like something waiting for the next step to begin. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly across the Texas plains, turning the dark into a muted gray and then into a pale, dusty gold that revealed every fence post, every stretch of dry earth, and every forgotten corner of the ranch that most men no longer bothered to see. And Ethan was already awake when the first light touched the barn walls, standing just inside the doorway with his eyes fixed on the land beyond, the same direction the foal had held through the night, behind him. The small animal shifted, its hooves pressing softly into the straw, and though it had never seen the sunrise, it reacted to it in its own way, lifting its head as if sensing the change in warmth, in air, in something deeper than light itself. Ethan turned back, studying it for a moment, the thin frame, the unsteady legs, the eyes that did not follow movement yet seemed far from empty. And without thinking too much about what he was risking, he reached for an old length of rope hanging by the stall and fashioned a loose lead, careful and slow so as not to startle it. When he slipped it gently around the foal's neck, it did not resist, did not pull away. Instead it stood still, ears flicking once as if acknowledging the gesture, then angled its head slightly toward the open door, already focused on what lay outside. Ethan exhaled quietly, a faint trace of disbelief crossing his face, and stepped forward, giving the rope the slightest guidance. But the foal did not wait for instruction. It moved first, One careful step, then another, its hooves finding the uneven ground as if guided by something beneath the surface rather than above it. And Ethan followed, not leading so much as keeping pace. They crossed the edge of the barnyard slowly, the dirt cool underfoot, the early air carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water that had not seen rain in too long. And with each step the foal grew steadier, its movements gaining a quiet confidence that did not match its fragile appearance. A few hundred yards out, the ranch began to open wider, the fences stretching thinner, the land less maintained, and Ethan glanced once over his shoulder toward the main house, half expecting someone to call out, to question what he was doing. But the morning remained still, the workers not yet stirring, the millionaire far removed from this forgotten side of his own land. Ahead, the faint metallic sound returned, clearer now in the stillness of dawn, a hollow, uneven clink that echoed softly across the open ground, and before Ethan could fully register it, the foal responded, its ears lifting sharply, its body aligning with that direction with unmistakable certainty. And then it began to walk faster, not stumbling, not hesitating, but moving with purpose that pulled Ethan forward along with it. The terrain shifted as they moved, the flat dirt giving way to patches of cracked earth and scattered brush, the remnants of an area long ignored. And with each step the sound grew more distinct, not louder in volume, but clearer in pattern, like something caught in motion somewhere out of sight. Ethan tightened his grip on the rope slightly, not to control, but to stay connected, his eyes scanning the horizon, searching for anything that might explain what the foal seemed to already understand. They reached the edge of the unused section of the ranch just as the sun lifted fully above the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground like lines drawn towards something unseen. And there, beyond a collapsed fence line and a cluster of rusted equipment half buried in dust, the sound came again, sharper this time, metal brushing against metal in a slow, rhythmic motion that did not belong to the wind. The foal stopped abruptly, its body going still, its head lifted high, facing directly toward the source, and Ethan followed its gaze, his breath slowing as his eyes settled on a shape in the distance he had never noticed before, something partially hidden, something that should not have been there. And in that quiet moment, standing beside a creature that could not see, yet somehow knew exactly where to look, Ethan felt the first real shift in everything he thought he understood about this land. The shape in the distance did not belong to anything Ethan recognized at first. It sat low against the earth, half swallowed by years of dust and neglect, its edges softened by time. Yet something about it held its place against the morning light as if it refused to disappear completely. And as he stood there, the faint metallic sound came again, clearer now, a slow brushing of rusted parts moving just enough to speak without revealing themselves fully. Beside him, the foal did not hesitate. It took a step forward, then another, the rope between them loosening as Ethan allowed it to lead, his eyes narrowing against the rising sun as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The ground beneath their feet shifted subtly as they moved closer, the hard cracked surface giving way to patches that felt slightly hollow, as if something beneath had changed the way the earth settled, and the air carried a different scent here, not just dry grass and dust, but something older, faintly metallic, like rain that had not fallen in years. The foal stopped again about 20 yards from the object, its body still, its head lifted high, ears fixed forward with a focus that made Ethan's chest tighten, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ethan stepped ahead cautiously, shortening the distance one careful step at a time, his boots pressing into the ground with a dull, uneven sound, and as he drew closer, the shape began to reveal itself piece by piece, not all at once, but in fragments that slowly connected into something familiar yet out of place. It was metal, that much was clear, but not just any metal. It carried the curved lines of something once built with purpose, something that had belonged somewhere else before ending up here. And the more he looked, the more the details sharpened, a broken edge, a bent frame, a section of what looked like a wheel or gear half buried beneath layers of dirt and time. The sound came again, and this time Ethan saw it, a loose piece shifting slightly in the morning breeze, striking against another surface with that same hollow note the foal had been following all night. He exhaled slowly, crouching down as he brushed away a thin layer of dust with his hand, revealing a dull, weathered surface beneath, marked by scratches and faint lines that hinted at age, not recent damage, but something that had been here far longer than he had ever known. Behind him, the foal shifted its weight and stepped forward, closing the distance on its own, its hooves landing carefully as if it understood exactly where to place them, and when it stopped beside him, its head angled downward slightly. Facing the same patch of ground Ethan had just uncovered, he glanced at it briefly, then back at the metal beneath his hand, a quiet realization beginning to form, not complete yet, but enough to unsettle something deep inside him. This was not just forgotten equipment, not something left behind by accident. It felt placed, hidden, or perhaps abandoned with intention. The ranch owner had always spoken of this section of land as worthless, land that produced nothing, land that was not worth the effort to maintain. And yet here, just beneath the surface, something remained, something that still moved, still made its presence known to anything willing to listen closely enough. Ethan sat back slightly on his heels, his gaze drifting across the surrounding ground, noticing small details he had ignored all his life, the uneven patches, the subtle dips in the earth, the way certain areas seemed to hold the morning light differently. And for the first time, the idea that this place had a story, one that had never been told, settled into his mind. The foal let out a soft breath, barely audible, and lowered its head a fraction more, as if urging him to keep looking, to not stop at what could be seen on the surface. And Ethan felt that same quiet pull again, the one that had kept him from walking away the night before, stronger now, more defined, guiding him towards something he had not yet uncovered but could no longer ignore. The longer Ethan remained there, the more the ground began to speak in ways he had never noticed before, not through sound alone, but through subtle shifts in texture and weight beneath his boots. And as he pressed his palm against the exposed metal again, he felt something faint, not movement exactly, but a lingering vibration, as though whatever lay buried beneath had once carried force, purpose, motion that had not entirely faded with time. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his hands, his gaze sweeping across the surrounding area with new attention, and what had once looked like random neglect now revealed a pattern, slight rises and depressions in the earth forming a loose outline, too deliberate to be natural, too spread out to be coincidence. The foal moved beside him, its small frame steady despite the uneven ground, and once again it angled its head downward, focusing not on the exposed metal alone, but on a point just a few feet away, a place where the dirt appeared no different than anywhere else. And yet something in the animal's stillness suggested otherwise. Ethan stepped toward that spot, his boots pressing into the surface, and he paused, noticing how the ground gave slightly more than it should, not soft, but less firm, as if the layer beneath had been disturbed long ago and never fully settled back into place. He crouched again, using his fingers to scrape away at the dry topsoil, the grains shifting easily at first, then resisting slightly as he dug deeper, revealing a darker layer beneath, compact and undisturbed for years. The foal leaned closer, its breath warm against the back of his hand, and though it could not see what he was doing, it stayed aligned with his movement, as if sensing each small discovery through something other than sight. The sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the land, and in that brightness the contrast became clearer, faint lines running through the ground, subtle but undeniable, leading away from the initial piece of metal and extending farther across the unused section of the ranch. Ethan followed one of those lines with his eyes, tracing it several yards out until it disappeared beneath another patch of hardened earth, and a thought formed, quiet but insistent, that whatever had been left here was not a single object, but part of something larger, something that had been broken apart, scattered, and left to be forgotten. Behind him, the wind picked up slightly, and the loose metal piece struck again with that same hollow sound, a reminder that had first drawn them here. And for a moment Ethan stood between what he could see and what he could not, between the evidence beneath his hands and the unanswered questions stretching out before him. He turned his attention back to the foal, studying the way it held itself, not uncertain, not afraid, but anchored, as if this place meant something it did not yet have words for. and that quiet certainty unsettled him more than anything else. "You knew this was here," he said softly, not expecting an answer, but feeling the truth of it settle anyway. And the foal responded in the only way it could, shifting its stance slightly, its ears flicking once toward the same unseen direction it had followed since the night before. Ethan straightened, his eyes narrowing against the growing light as he looked out across the land again, seeing now not emptiness, but a field of buried clues, each one waiting beneath the surface, each one connected in a way he had yet to understand. And in that moment, the decision that had begun as a quiet instinct turned into something more defined, something that would not let him walk away, because whatever had been hidden here, whatever the ranch owner had dismissed as worthless, was still speaking, and for reasons he could not yet explain. The only one truly listening was standing beside him, a small, blind foal that had never once needed to see in order to find what mattered. The sun had climbed high enough to burn the last traces of cool from the air, and the land around Ethan no longer felt quiet in the same way it had at dawn. It felt exposed, as if whatever had been hidden here was now waiting to be seen under full light. And yet with that clarity came something else, a tension that settled low in his chest as he realized this place was not as forgotten as he had believed. He straightened from the ground, wiping the dust from his hands again, and for a moment he considered walking back, pretending none of this mattered, returning to the part of the ranch where questions were not asked and answers were never expected. But the thought did not hold, not with the foal standing beside him, still and certain, still facing the same direction as if the land itself had drawn a line only it could follow. The wind shifted once more, stronger now, carrying the distant sounds of the main ranch coming to life, engines turning over, voices beginning to rise, and Ethan knew it would not be long before someone noticed he was gone, or worse, noticed what he had taken with him. He reached for the rope instinctively, not to pull, but to steady himself, and the foal responded with a small step forward, as if urging him to continue, rather than retreat, and that simple movement was enough to push his hesitation aside. He followed the faint lines in the ground further, walking slowly along the uneven surface, his eyes tracing the subtle patterns that now seemed impossible to ignore, and every few yards he found another clue, a fragment of metal, a shift in the soil, a place where the earth dipped just slightly more than it should, all of it connected, all of it pointing towards something larger buried beneath years of silence. The foal moved with him, never straying, never losing direction, its head turning slightly at intervals, as if recalibrating to something only it could sense. And each time it adjusted, Ethan found himself looking again at the ground beneath his feet, discovering something new that he had missed only seconds before. They reached a point where the land rose gently, a low ridge that overlooked the rest of the unused section. And from there Ethan could see the pattern more clearly, the scattered fragments forming a rough path, a trail that led from the edge of the property toward this very spot, as if something had once moved across the land and then disappeared beneath it. He stood there, breathing slowly, the weight of realization settling in piece by piece, and then the foal stepped forward again, stopping near the top of the ridge, its body still, its ears fixed forward, its entire posture focused on a single point just ahead. Ethan moved beside it, his gaze following the same direction, and there, partially hidden beneath a thin layer of earth and dry grass, was something different from the rest, not scattered, not broken, but whole, or at least more intact than anything they had seen so far. He knelt again, brushing away the dirt carefully, revealing a smooth surface beneath, less worn than the other pieces, its edges defined, its shape deliberate. And as more of it came into view, a strange quiet fell over him. Not confusion, not fear, but recognition of something that did not belong to chance. The foal lowered its head slightly, its breath steady, its presence calm, as if this was the place it had been guiding him toward all along. And Ethan felt it then, a shift. Deeper than curiosity, a sense that whatever lay beneath this final layer of earth was not just forgotten. It had been left here for a reason, and that reason was beginning to surface, slowly, inevitably, under the steady gaze of a man who had finally chosen to see what others had refused to acknowledge. The surface beneath Ethan's hands felt different from anything he had uncovered before, smoother, more deliberate, as if it had been placed rather than scattered, and as he brushed away the remaining dirt, the outline became clearer, not just a piece of machinery, but something shaped with intent, a sealed metal panel set into the earth, its edges still holding firm despite the years that had tried to erase it. He paused, his fingers resting against the cool surface, and for a moment the wind seemed to fall away, leaving only the faint sound of the foal's breathing beside him and the distant hum of the ranch far beyond the ridge. The foal stepped closer, its small body steady now, its head lowering until it hovered just above the panel, not touching, but aligning perfectly with its center, as if it had reached the exact point it had been searching for since the night before. Ethan glanced at it, then back at the metal, and something about the stillness of that moment settled into him with quiet certainty. This was not random. This was not forgotten by accident. This had been left here, sealed, hidden, waiting. He pressed his hand along the edge and felt a slight indentation, a narrow seam where the panel met the earth, and with careful effort he began to clear more of the surrounding dirt, working slowly, methodically, until enough of the surface was exposed to reveal a small handle, nearly invisible beneath the layers of dust. His breath slowed as he reached for it, his grip firm but cautious, and for a second he hesitated, not from fear, but from the weight of what might follow, because once something buried is brought into the light, it cannot return to silence. The foal shifted beside him, its ears flicking once, and that small movement was enough. Ethan tightened his hold and pulled. The panel resisted at first, the years pressing against it, but then with a low, heavy sound it gave way, lifting just enough to break the seal that had held it closed, and a faint rush of stale air escaped from beneath, carrying with it a scent that did not belong to the open plains, something older, enclosed, preserved. Ethan lifted the panel further, setting it aside carefully, and leaned forward, his eyes adjusting to the shadowed space below, and what he saw there did not match anything he had expected. Not broken scrap, not discarded parts, but something intact, something organized, something that had been deliberately hidden beneath the land. Inside lay a collection of metal crates, stacked with precision, their surfaces marked with faded lettering that had resisted time just enough to remain legible, and beside them, secured within a reinforced frame, was a piece of equipment unlike anything used on the ranch, its structure complex, its purpose unclear at first glance, but unmistakably valuable, not in the simple sense of scrap or salvage, but in the kind of value that changes the way land is measured. Ethan's chest tightened as the realization began to take shape. This was not a forgotten dumping ground. This was a concealed storage, something placed here with intention and never meant to be found again. Behind him, the wind returned, brushing across the ridge, and the loose metal fragments scattered across the field answered with that same hollow sound, echoing now with new meaning. No longer random noise, but the faint signal of something hidden just beneath the surface. The foal stood quietly at his side, its head still angled toward the open space, its presence calm, almost knowing, as if the journey had led exactly where it was meant to. And Ethan understood then, not fully, not every detail, but enough to know that this discovery did not belong to him alone. It was tied to the land, to the ranch, and to the man who had claimed it was worthless. He looked out across the property once more, the morning now fully awake, the distance no longer empty, but filled with possibility and consequence. And for the first time since he had lifted the foal from the dirt, he felt the weight of what came next settle firmly into place. Because some truths, once uncovered, do not stay buried, no matter how long they have waited. The weight of what lay beneath the open ground did not fully settle on Ethan until he heard the distant sound of an engine cutting through the morning air, low at first, then growing sharper as it moved closer across the ranch. And instinctively, he turned toward the sound, his body tightening in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with understanding that this moment, quiet and hidden only minutes ago, was about to change. The foal remained still beside him, its head lowered slightly now, no longer searching, no longer listening for direction, as if the purpose that had guided it here had been fulfilled, and in that stillness there was something calm, something grounded, as though it had already accepted whatever came next. Ethan looked back down into the open space, at the crates, at the sealed equipment, at the careful arrangement that spoke of intention rather than accident. And he knew without needing proof that this was something the ranch owner had never wanted anyone to find. Something buried not because it had no value, but because it held too much of the wrong kind. The engine sound grew louder, tires crunching against gravel somewhere beyond the ridge, and Ethan exhaled slowly, reaching down to replace the metal panel, not to hide it again, but to protect what remained inside until it could no longer be ignored, his movements steady, deliberate, as if each action carried a weight that could not be undone. When he finished, he stood upright, brushing the dust from his hands one final time, and turned toward the direction of the approaching vehicle, his expression no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but settled into something quieter, something resolved. The truck appeared moments later at the edge of the ridge, sunlight catching against its windshield, and when it came to a stop, the door opened with a sharp sound that carried across the still air, followed by the figure of the man who owned everything this land touched, stepping down with the same confidence he carried into every decision, every command, every dismissal of anything that did not serve his purpose. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the area, taking in the broken fence line, the scattered metal fragments, and finally settling on Ethan and the small figure standing beside him. And for the first time, there was a pause, brief but unmistakable, as something in the scene did not align with the version of this land he believed he controlled. Ethan did not step back, did not lower his gaze. He simply stood where he was, the rope loose in his hand, the full calm at his side. And in that quiet stance there was no challenge, no accusation, only the presence of something that could not be dismissed as easily as before. The wind moved between them, carrying the faint metallic echo once more, softer now, but enough to linger in the space. And the ranch owner's eyes shifted slightly toward the ground, toward the ridge, toward the place where the truth had rested unseen for years. And though he said nothing at first, the certainty in his posture changed, just enough to reveal what words had not yet spoken. Ethan let the silence hold, not out of defiance, but because he understood something now that he had not the night before, that some truths do not need to be forced into the open. They rise on their own once the right moment arrives, and all that is required is someone willing to stand still long enough to let them surface. Beside him, the foal took a small step forward, its hooves pressing gently into the earth, its head lifting slightly as if sensing the shift in the air, and in that simple movement, something passed between all three of them, unspoken but undeniable, that the balance had changed, that what had been hidden no longer belonged to the silence. Ethan glanced down at the small creature for a brief second, his hand resting lightly against its neck, and a quiet thought settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and clear, that this animal, born without sight, had seen more in a single night than most men ever would in a lifetime. The wind carried across the plains again, softer now, moving through the fences, through the dry grass, through the spaces where something once buried had begun to rise, and Ethan stood there without speaking, without needing to, because sometimes the strongest truth does not come from what is said, but from what can no longer be hidden, and sometimes the one who cannot see is the one who leads the rest of the world toward it.